Good evening and welcome. We're so glad that you all could join us from wherever you're joining us. We currently are on the campus of The Ohio State University at Cohatch, one of our offices for the Buckeyes for Christ. So glad that you could join us this evening in this location. We're very excited about this 12 questions and what it all means and what it is. And I know a lot of you may have actually some questions about it. But more than anything, questions is really what it's all about. Over the last couple months, we've been asking people in our community and around the world, if you could ask God any one question, what would it be? And now we've taken those top 12 genres of questions that have come in, and we've set forth these answers from the Bible for you. And we hope it'll be of benefit to you. So no matter where you're tuning in, if you're coming in from Facebook, if you're in YouTube, wherever you might be, let us know in the comments. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Even if you're watching this after the fact, tune in, let us know where you're from so we can interact with you and get to know you in some form or fashion. I'm excited that we get to start off this first night with one of my favorite guests, and candidly, this is an easy one for me because my father is here, Dr. Terry Edwards. He is a full professor at Freed-Hardeman University in Bible and Humanities. And so when the first question came up, are the places and towns in the Bible real? Are they real places? There was no one better I could think of to answer this question than him. Having spent most of his life abroad in Italy and Greece and different places in the Middle East, I'm grateful that he has chosen this opportunity to come and be with us in this time, in this moment, to answer this very important question. So at this point in time, I'll turn it over to him to answer this first question.
It's a privilege to be part of this occasion. It is important. These are times in which questions are left unanswered, and with regard to the Bible, that would be a serious tragedy in my opinion. I love this first one that was given to me not only because of what life experiences I've had, but because it allows me to speak of the evidence that I have from my personal faith. I have carried my faith for over 50 years personally, and I have not changed my mind yet. But every day that you wake up, you need to ask yourself, has God made you an intelligent, rational person? Or is there evidence for the faith that I have in the Scriptures? Are the towns and places in the Bible real? I'll be using some images from the PowerPoint that I have here, and I'll be pointing to those, and so hope that you are able to see those. And it should be, there you go, moving to the next slide. There are a lot of people in our time, especially in the last 3 centuries, that have begun to question the authority of Scripture. There are really 4 attitudes that can be held about the Bible at this point. Here are 3 listed at the top. The 4th one is the one that I hold, and maybe you hold too. It's called plenary inspiration. That is, until I have proof that something is not true, there is error in the Bible, I will find it to be correct. And I will stake my faith and my life on it. But here are 3 major attitudes towards it. The Bible is all mythology. Mythology means there's something at the core that may be real, maybe a person or a place, but the majority of the rest of it's all made up. A second attitude towards it, the Bible's worth lies only in that which can be explained completely by human reason. The second one says, well, I like the Bible, a lot of great stories, but when it comes to miracles, like the Egyptians drowning in the Red Sea or others like that, then we've got a completely set, and the miracle of Jesus appearing to Paul on the road to Damascus or feeding of 5,000, then we've got a very different situation. I'm out at that point. That's the way some are. There's a third one. The Bible is not entirely the Word of God, but it contains it. This gives you flexibility. What I mean by that is you can kind of like walk through a cafeteria, whether it's here of the campus or wherever it is. You can choose the meatloaf if you like it. You can skip the green beans because you've had too much of it. You can kind of pick through, rip out the pages of the Bible, rip out the stories, rip out the affirmations, the things that it states, and pick and choose what you like. That's not really the Bible. The problem with the Bible on that issue is it requires you to accept it all or nothing. It will not accept a partial way. Let me give you an example. Maybe you've seen the movies of the Lord of the Rings. Great series of that J.R. Tolkien, the 1930s, that British philologist and fantasy writer. The Lord of the Rings is completely made up. The lands are made up. The characters are made up. The conversations are made up. It's complete fiction. On the other hand, there are other works, like, for example, maybe you've heard of this one. For 28 centuries, the Iliad and the Odyssey have been a twin set of epic poems that have been a dominant have had a dominant place in the history of Western culture and in schools, in scholastic education. Lately, we've kind of abandoned it, but the reading of the Iliad and the Odyssey, in my case, in my school, we had to do it in the original language, but even if in the English translation were required, because they were kind of like the Bible of the ancient pagan Greeks, as they looked to those for their heroic values and things like that. Up until the 19th century, most people thought that the Iliad and the Odyssey were complete fiction, like Tolkien, like the Lord of the Rings. On the other hand, there was a gentleman by the name of Heinrich Schliemann, a Russian-German businessman who married a beautiful young Greek wife. And with the money and with the desire, and his mother had read him the Iliad when he was growing up, he wanted to go find out with his money, was there anything real about Mycenae and Troy and that Trojan expedition and 1,000 black ships sailing across the Aegean Sea to conquer a place called Troy, to punish them for stealing one of the wives? Homer is a great poet. Some question whether he ever existed, kind of like some question the existence of Shakespeare too. Homer was a great talented bard, a teller of stories, who inherited tales about the heroic fights and virtues and faults of the Greek warriors like Achilles and Agamemnon and their counterparts, the Trojans, like Hector and Priam, the king of Troy. And he told it, put them together, in particular with the Iliad, with 16,000 lines of dactylic hexameter, and they're amazing. But are they made up completely? And the answer is no. That is, the Iliad has moved since the 1870s from the category of completely made up, as it was thought to be before that, to the category of there's a core, there's something real, then the gods, the conversation with the gods, one of the gods pulling back the hair of Achilles, or whatever it is, those are made up. But there are parts that are absolutely real. Here's the point. It's a logical question to ask. Are those stories, those places, the geography, the rivers, are they real, the ones that are mentioned in the Bible? The Bible is full, in the Old Testament, but also in the New, of places and towns and trips and travels. And the question is, can we count on them? What you see here is artifacts that Mr. Schliemann found in his excavations in the 1870s. Here is the Lion Gate of the citadel of Mycenae that was the fortress of Agamemnon, who led the expedition to Troy. Here is the geography, and they assembled right here and went to Troy, and that's where, as we call it, Troas in the New Testament, called Troy in ancient times, that's where you will see the battle took place. There are excavations that he made, and he found the ramp. There were about 9 different levels that he found of Troy. He thinks he found the one out of which every morning for 10 years, at least we are told, the Trojan poured out to attack the Greeks who were in camps along the beach, who were wanting there to exterminate them. These are the swords of the Mycenaean warriors. Oh yes, they were real. So there's a core that's real, and then there's a lot of made up in those beautiful 16,000 lines of musical poetry that are told by the great poet Homer in recounting this great story. The question is the Bible a little bit real and the rest of it is fluff? How much of it is total mythology? And here is what I am at, where I hope you will be when you investigate this fully past the time that I have tonight. 2 Timothy 3 in verse 16 and 17 says something that maybe you've heard at some point. All Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be competent, equipped for every good work. This was written by a man called Paul, had a PhD in rabbinic literature, and he was from a city called Tarsus, but he went to college in Jerusalem, and he was the most educated of all the apostles of Jesus Christ. And he says, as he writes his last letter before he's decapitated in Rome, he says, all of Scripture, that includes the Old Testament that he grew up with, and the letters now of those that have walked and talked with Jesus, what you and I have now as the New Testament, the apostolic letters, or those that walked with the apostles as well. Here's the thing. The Bible, the New Testament, claims to be inspired, so that means it has to pass a very high bar. It can't be it can't be fiction. It can't be part fiction. It can be no fiction at all. If it says it's inspired by God, if the divine is involved in this, then it's protected from error. That's the highest bar there is. And it needs to pass that test effectively. And that means you need to bring your study and your research and your questions to the biblical text and get some answers as much as possible. One last point before I leave this. Claiming to be inspired by God doesn't necessarily make it so. For example, 1.6 billion people in the world are Muslim, and they read their holy scriptures of the Quran. And those were collections of the teachings of Muhammad when he died suddenly in 632. And here's the point. He says Jesus was a prophet, but he wasn't the Son of God, and he didn't resurrect. Now, the New Testament can't be correct, and the Quran. One of the two is wrong. One of the two is incorrect on a very important feature, maybe the most important fact in all of human history. The Bible claims to be inspired like the Quran does. Okay? One of the two is not. But here still remains, as we're looking at the Bible, is there evidence for that? And here's where I introduce you to one thing that makes it different from any other collection of Holy Scriptures of whatever man-made religion you may have been familiar with, read about, or whatever. The Bible's different. Here are some things that no other book of mankind can live up to. How on earth do you have the unity, the coherence, the same goal, when all these factors are what compose the biblical writings? 66 books are contained in the Old and New Testament, written by 40 plus different authors that over a span of not a few decades. They weren't all in the same room, they weren't all in the same college, in the same theology school. They were over a period of 1,500 years, and it was from the 14th century before Christ, the time approximately of Moses, all the way to the death of John the Revelator, the last book of the New Testament. They were in 3 different continents. They were in Asia, they were in Africa, and they were in what we call Europe now. They're written mostly in Hebrew, but there's some Aramaic. And then, of course, the New Testament is in Greek. And they were not all scholars writing in their offices in the ivory tower in some university somewhere. There was only one of the apostles that had a terminal degree, so to speak. Some of them were highly trained in the Old Testament, but they were priests, physicians, farmers, fishermen, shepherds, scholars, conquerors, captives, under different circumstances. Even tax collectors wrote as well. How did they all get the same story right? How did they all converge? How did they all meet at the same place? And how did they do that while the Bible tackles all the greatest questions of the human condition, of the human life? About 3 centuries ago, in our Western civilization, we began to question Scripture a whole lot. It was the Enlightenment period when we were detaching from state religions, you could say, and the impressive presence of religion in science and in literature and in politics and many other areas. There were some reasons for that, but that said, that made some also start, without study and research, start to question the authority of Scripture as a whole, not just its interpretation by certain men over time. In particular, in the last 2 centuries, we've had a lot of questioning, and sometimes from inside, that is from theologians. We've had a lot of questioning of things, and here is the area that I'd like to go to the time I have left. Archaeology is a study of old rocks, archaeologos. It wasn't a discipline, and there were no museums before 2 centuries, and they didn't have old rocks to tell stories, not only of scientific ages, but especially of the stories of mankind. Only in the last 2 centuries have we started spending a lot of money and research and archaeologists, which I am not, by the way, but I have a good friend that is. Here's the point. Biblical archaeology came along just right at the right time to put a patch in a hole that was forming in the questioning of biblical authority. That is, what we have is in a time when there were people saying those cities are not real, those people are not real, those events are not real, those terms for those politicians of that city are not real. There were theologians starting to question, and they did it without evidence. And biblical archaeology came along to give all kinds of proof of, no, if today, while you study and still look at the biblical text, you're still on the side of, well, I lean towards my biases for the authority and authenticity of Bible rather than I disprove of any story. If you can't prove it to me, then I'm out. Well, here's the 2 things. Persistent doubts have really hurt the faith or the burgeoning faith and new faith of many. And biblical archaeology is an area that I would recommend that you go to. Let me start real quick with the time that I've got left. Jericho, probably the oldest city in the world, at least that's what some believe. I don't know when the earth was formed, Genesis chapter 1. I don't know the century or the millennium for that much. All I know is that I don't buy into the numbers of Jurassic Park. I'm a lot earlier than that. That said, Jericho goes back at least 7,000 years before Christ, maybe 10,000 years ago. Damascus is actually the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. But the story of Jericho, maybe you know it from Joshua 6. If you don't, read it tonight. Joshua 6 posits a people coming across the Jordan River, and they're not warriors. They just spent 40 years in the desert. And Jericho is a double-walled city, as this reproduction has here in your Bible. And they bring down a double-walled city by way of what? Going around once a day, then on the 7th day going around 7 times and blowing their horns. Right. Has that worked for anybody lately? It worked one time. That's all it has to work. Here's the point. This archaeologist here, even though there are still secular archaeologists that question, there were many archaeologists in the 1930s, 1950s, 1960s, Albright, Gerstang, Kathleen Kenyon, and many others. And they have disagreed. But here's a point. This gentleman right here is showing you where there was a revetment wall, a powerful cyclopean rocks that supported a mud brick wall. And that mud brick wall is not pushed in from the outside in, but it's pushed from the inside out. What does that say? It belongs to around the year 1400 AD. That's where I'm at still right now as regard to the Exodus and 2 million Jews coming across, protected by God in their first encounter with a major fortified city. You see, you got to be careful if you're going to question the Bible, because there's egg on the face of a lot of archaeologists and theologians in the century before. For example, in the Joshua chapter 3 and verse 10 of the Old Testament, there's a mention of Hittites, Girgashites, and a bunch of other ites, because when you put an ending to Hebrew names and ancient names, you got to put ites on the end, something like that. But they were non-existent in archaeology. Nobody knew anything about them. You can't make up a people. That proves you've got error. I mean, not a person or a place, a whole nation. And of course, until a German archaeological team found their capital, and there they are. It's in a place called Hattusha. And by the way, this is one of their gates, which is dedicated to the Sphinx, which tells you they had contact with the Egyptians and the Greeks, who both used this mythological animal as part of their scary gods, so to speak. Here are their 12 minor gods right here in a row. And there is a ceremonial pouring for a libation to the gods through this beautiful... we have treaties with the Egyptians. Now we have so much material. Guess what? Nobody questions the Hittites anymore. And that is how far they got. Most of what we call Turkey today, the capital was up there in north central Turkey. We now have that as well. But let's move to the New Testament. Capernaum, or Capharnaum as it's called today. It's mostly composed of Palestinians today. The city of Jesus. I love to go to Nazareth, but back in his time, when he was raised from the age of 2 to the age of 30 there in the construction business, it was only a place of about 400 people, the best we can estimate. So the only archaeological remains there. And we can't find the house of Jesus. That's not going to be found. But by the way, it's not mud huts. It's rock houses that are found from the first century. But we can go to the town that he moved to. When he came out from his earthly life to begin his ministry for 3 years, to preach and teach, to do those miracles, and to save the world by going to the cross. There it is, the top end of the Sea of Galilee, a freshwater lake that is 8.5 miles long, 6.5 miles wide. And yes, it's real. And there are the houses right there in black basalt, the foundations of the houses of fishermen. It was a big fishing industry. From 400, Jesus moved to about 1,500 to 2,000. And it's a real place. And there it is along the coast of North. And this is said to be a house that maybe was the house of Peter. Jesus will say, I don't even own a coat. I don't own a house. He didn't have anything. He didn't have property. So where did he stay when he was in Capernaum? Did he stay in the house of Peter? Christians of the 4th and 5th century thought, because they found some items in there, that was the house of Peter. So they thought maybe that was the bedroom of Jesus. We don't know that. You've got to watch out between what you would like to find and what you actually know. What I know is that black basalt foundation right there is the foundation of the synagogue that Jesus did a miracle in. And there was a synagogue ruler who had us. That is real. The places are real. And that, by the way, is the rebuilt synagogue. In the 4th century, the Jews tested the metal and the authority of the Romans with the rebellion in 132. And the Romans destroyed every single synagogue in all of Palestine. And so they had to be rebuilt afterwards. But there it is, the foundation that Jesus and Peter and the rest of them were in. Jerusalem. I am showing you a model because Jerusalem is both an amazing place. I was just there this past March, and it is the convergence of all 3 monotheistic religions. But let me remind you again, those who are still practicing Orthodox Judaism, they can't be right if they're still expecting the Messiah, if the Messiah came. Christianity says the Messiah came. He was an Orthodox Jew from Nazareth, and then he came to Jerusalem. And Muslims think, besides the birthplace and death place of Muhammad, Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem is the 3rd holiest place in the world. It is a conglomeration of 3 monotheistic religions. You can hear the calls to prayer of the Muslims, the hymns of Christians, and you can hear also on the Shabbat the prayers at the western wall of the Jews. You're not going to find anything related to the 1st century because wars and devastations. The Romans destroyed it completely in 70 AD. Then it had crusaders, and then it had Muslim crusaders, 8 different crusades, and so history has made it impossible. But what we have is a mosaic with which we build a giant-size model of Jerusalem at the time of Christ. That's a mosaic that was found in the Second Temple times, the time of Jesus and the apostles. So you can see the Temple Mount and had a clear, huge presence. You can see the walls, the set of walls. The Romans only took 3 months with their siege towers to take that at a casualty cost of 12,000. You see, if God's not going to help you out against Roman legions, then you're going to lose. And they did. And God wasn't there that day for many reasons. He didn't show up. There's the Temple Mount, 13 acres. It had been destroyed, the ones built by Solomon. So the one you're looking at it in model was rebuilt over 4 centuries, from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and all the way to the time of Jesus. When they're walking out one time during the last week of Jesus' life, the apostles say, "Isn't it beautiful?" And they're proud. They look at all the fine bronze, gilded bronze and gold and marble and architecture. It's taken 4 centuries to get back to the splendor of the times of the Solomon's temple that had lasted for 400 years before Nebuchadnezzar brought it down. But there it is right there, 13 acres with the Holy of Holies, 90 feet high up in the air. That's where Jesus was. I know that's a model, but you see it's created from a mosaic. 1st century Jerusalem, which you see the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John play out as Jesus goes to Jerusalem 3 times with the entourage, and the last time he went intentionally to be caught and to be killed, die on the cross, and resurrect. Philippi, maybe the story of Lydia. maybe it's the first city in Europe, as we call it now. It wasn't called that back then. It was during the second missionary journey. The one traveling here in the book of Acts, a story that's written down by a medical doctor named Luke, written in beautiful Greek, by the way. He was probably a good doctor, but he's definitely a good narrator. And the point is, he doesn't make up stuff. You can check out terms that he uses for politicians in the cities. You can check out the distances and times that he gives for travel. Very specific details. Here he is. Paul wants to go, I think, to Ephesus, but he's brought to Troas. Acts chapter 16 says that he, let me use a modern illustration, was sitting at Starbucks wondering, where am I going to go now? He had a vision that said, come to Macedonia. Macedonia was that area of northern Greece where Alexander the Great had been king back about 3 centuries before. And I don't think Paul wanted to go there. I think he had to have a vision to tell him, get on a boat. He was in 3 shipwrecks. If you've been in 3 train wrecks, would you take the train? I don't think he wanted to, but the call was to go there because there were major cities up there, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. What can I show you of Paul in New Testament times? I can show you this right here. That's the street, even though it's not mentioned in Acts chapter 16, the major highway that the Romans had built back 150 years before, the Egnatian Way, under the command of a Roman general named Ignatius. The Roman legionnaires were the fighting forces of Rome, who then constructed roads and colosseums and entertainment centers. That's what they did. And there were 30 legions, by the way. And they were the most amazing military effort ever seen in antiquity. They built a road that went from the Black Sea all the way to the Adriatic Sea. And it goes right through the downtown middle of Philippi, and then Thessalonica, and then Berea. Paul, in his missionary methodology, stays with big towns because he doesn't know how long he has, and he's in a hurry to evangelize as many towns as he can and let it spread out from there. And so while I don't have the Ignatian Way right here, you see the chariot tracks on it, first century road that he walked on, him and his 3 companions as well. One more thing. Lydia, he found in Philippi there was no synagogue. That's very rare. The Jews were everywhere in the Roman Empire, more outside of Palestine than in. And they had synagogues because those were schools and the place where on Sabbath they did worship. And he was surprised to not find any synagogues in Philippi. There was a historical reason for that. The Jews and Greeks had all been kicked out by the first Roman Emperor, Octavian Augustus Caesar. And so all those homes had been given over to veteran military combatants, legionnaires of Rome. It was a Roman colony, basically, is what it was. So no synagogues. You have to have 10 Jewish men over the age of 13 to have a synagogue. That was the rule back then anyway. What is this? You wouldn't even fish in it, but it's called the Crenides. It's called the Little River because Paul had to look for anybody interested in spiritual things here, or is it all about the marketplace? This is the forum of downtown Philippi. Okay, they were buying and selling and talking politics and sports. You know what we do. Okay, and they weren't discussing life and eternity and things that were spiritual. So he went out by a little waterway, a river, to find somebody that was looking for a quiet place of prayer. Her name is Lydia. She was a businesswoman from Thyatira, and she and her household were baptized. That's real. Absolutely. Athens, Acts chapter 17. The Apostle Paul goes to Athens, a city that's the intellectual center of the ancient world. Rome is the political center, 2 million people. Athens only has about 50,000 at that time, so it's Podunkville, but it's got the reputation of being the intelligentsia of the world. All the philosophy schools of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates had come from there. And in those times, it was Epicurean Stoic philosophers that were the dominant 2 universities, you could say, in downtown Athens. Here is today the excavations. Can I point you to anything that belongs specifically to the time of the New Testament? Well, here is that temple dedicated to Athena, the Parthenon. That's why it's called Athens. They chose her as their favorite one centuries before. And it had 69 columns. And it was built over 11 years by the 2 greatest construction designers, Callicrates and Nyctinus. And it was a marvel. All 69 of those columns lean a little bit in, and they meet 1.5 miles up in the air. An engineering feat like no other, still being studied today for its amazing thing. It's not as big as the pyramids of Egypt, but definitely from an engineering point of view, still a marvel of ancient times. This is what Paul has to compete with. It's a fantastic building. Too bad the lights are on, but nobody's home. That's the house of the goddess, but she's fictional. She's made up. And there's people snaking up to that place right up there, taking offerings to a goddess that doesn't exist. And he stands up on Mars Hill right here by himself and heads off 50 or 100 PhDs of the time, the Stoic Epicurean, who's saying, what is this babbler? The Greek word is kind of strong. This guy that speaks gobbledygook talks about an Eastern God they never heard. Yeshua. Who's Yeshua? Jesus, okay? He has to compete with the temple to Poseidon, the temple to Athena. And he alone says, God has given you time up to now, and you pursued the divine in many ways. I'm here to tell you about the only God, the unknown God, not the one that you built massive houses to, massive temples to. There you go. Corinth, he spent 1.5 years, the Apostle Paul did, Acts chapter 18. And here we've got some actual confirmation of the presence of the Christian story. Look, Corinth is right here. It was the 3rd largest city in the empire at the time. Rome was number 1 with 2 million, Alexandria of Egypt with 1 million, and then there was Corinth, 700,000 people. It had been totally destroyed by the Romans to prove to the Greeks, don't mess with us, then totally rebuilt by Julius Caesar with his own money, a city rebuilt by Julius Caesar. Then he was assassinated. It was beautiful. It was new. And this was still remnant when Paul came in there with his companions. He came in by himself, then he was joined by others later, Timothy and Silas. And the Temple of Apollo had been there for 6 centuries. Imagine if you walk into a city of 700,000 and there's a temple standing there on the hill to the god Apollo, god of prophecy, god of healing, god of music, god of visual arts, poetry. And he has that same message to tell. Beautiful building. Too bad that's not where the only true God lives. What we have records of that will confirm your faith in the narrative of Acts chapter 18 is 1, there are 7 to 8 pieces of fragments of a copy of a letter of the emperor at that time to the governor of this 3rd largest city in the empire. His name is Gallio. If you read Acts chapter 18, you'll find his name there, Gallio. We know about him. He's real. He's not made up. And there is archaeological proof of his presence. Here's another one right here. When Luke writes the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, he talks about a most excellent, noble Roman. And there it is in the Greek letters, capital, the name that he uses. Even a name is not made up. If it hasn't been found, it will, or something like that. And don't give up your faith in the text unless you have proof to the contrary, is the point. It stood the test of time. Here's an amazing one. Romans chapter 16 and verse 1 has Erastus mentioned as a city treasurer. And that in Latin says it used to be on a floor that was paid for by this very important elected position within 3rd largest city of the empire. He was the city treasurer. He was the construction manager of a large city. And that means he had a great salary and he was approved by the people of Corinth. And he is converted, and he's mentioned in Romans chapter 16 verse 1. Erastus, proeditate. Sue pecunie stravit. Erastus made this sidewalk, paid for this sidewalk with his own money. He was thanking the people of Corinth for electing him to this great position. I could go on. Ephesus, Paul spent 3 years there. You have Paul should have died in 56 right here in the theater. The theater is real. Read about it in Acts chapter 19. That's where he should have died, except that the Asiarchs, the politicians of a major city of the ancient world, 250,000 strong, and brethren, kept him by both arms and said, don't go in. There are a bunch of people jumping up and down. They're not thinking, they're a mob, and they're going to kill you. Please distinguish. For as much as we found, we can jump at things. For example, in Rome, there are the cell of Paul and Peter called the Mamertine prisons. Unfortunately, that's not archaeological finding, that's tradition. And there's a difference between tradition and what we can know to be true. It's correct for you to use your rationality and your questions, to bring it to the biblical text. But please remember, tradition is a different thing. People have meant well in the past and made up some things. The Colosseum is not where Christians were killed. We don't have any evidence of that. However, there were many whose blood was in the Circus Maximus, one of the other entertainment centers of Rome. This is the Ostian Way. Tradition says that's where Paul was beheaded, on the 3rd mile marker. And about 19 years ago, we thought we had the most incredible artifact found, a bone box with the bones of the stepbrother of Jesus, James. Unfortunately, because even people don't believe much in the biblical text or in Jesus, they still can make a lot of money off of him. And the Christianity is still a great moneymaker. So somebody probably made an inscription in Hebrew on a real bone box from 2,000 years ago. It said, Yeshua bar Yosef, and or James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. That was a fiction. That now is disproven. So we have to watch out to distinguish between tradition and real. Do we have enough real evidence for you to still put your faith in the Bible? Absolutely. Thank you for your question. Thank you for listening.
I invite you over to come have a seat with me here. Follow up some questions and the rest. And so this is a little bit more of the informal aspect of the time. Really, it's just follow-up questions, and you're welcome to send in questions yourself on Facebook or YouTube or the rest. Let us know what questions come about when you listen to these things, when you hear about them. So the last part there is the one that's fascinating to me, because there is a jump at times that people make to try to find reasons for their faith when they're not possibly being as skeptical as even Scripture calls them to be in those situations.
That's right.
And so give us some other examples. I know the bone box of James is one, maybe even the archaeological finds from the Red Sea that apparently have come up at times.
Right. It's, we're not going to find the Ark, I'm pretty sure. Ararat may be in the glaciers of Turkey. But, there's a problem that we have with artifacts. They're both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is they prove that the biblical stories are true. The curse is we tend to worship the artifact rather than the God or the story of the Bible. We forget. So you asked about which ones in particular?
So the Red Sea, that was one that came out a little while ago, was where suddenly they found all of the artifacts of the Egyptian army at the bottom of the Red Sea.
Right.
And that's kind of been disproven over and over
I would have
again.
loved for that to have been true. Because we don't know for sure which Red Sea, where the crossing. When you look in your Bible at the maps, at the Exodus, which, by the way, is either in the 15th century or 13th. That's early or late date. I put it in the 15th, so around 15th century, the time of Moses, the time of Joshua, etc. You would think that you would find plenty of archaeological evidence for 2 million people walking around for 40 years. However, when you visit Sinai, it takes you 2 seconds to realize why you're never going to find anything. Have you ever been to Arizona desert or California desert? Desert is like 22 below in the nighttime and 115 at night at daytime. Desert storms. I've been in 2 in Egypt, and they are imposing. They forgive nothing. They cover up everything. So no, and besides, they were intense. There's no archaeological evidence for that. So can we find at least where they crossed, where God, maybe using a windstorm or whatever, either way, the timing is what makes it a miracle. The Hebrew people got through while the Egyptians did not, and lost, by the way, a pharaoh and a whole army. So not only their firstborn sons, but also that double tragedy, all in a span of a few weeks. We don't know for sure. There was a set of wheels that were photographed at the bottom of one area, the 3 possible routes that they took. I still stick with the routes that's probably in your Bibles, but there are second and third routes that are given, and I don't have enough evidence to believe we have the chariots, wheels, of the Egyptian. Now, what's true is most chariots of ancient times had 8 spokes, while the Egyptian had 4. And they weren't eaten up by mollusks and salt because they were covered in a metal that wouldn't decay, and that is silver. So that is why. But are they the ones of the Egyptians? I don't know. I'd love for it to be.
So in essence, a lot of the questions that people might bring up in these moments, or even there's a strong desire to want to believe, not just that all these things are true, but that these specific moments that are then brought up are true without necessarily doing the research into them to see if it actually does match the biblical text. And so there's sometimes, we talk about it like a leap of faith, that there's a leap of faith. People say like, well, it has to be true because that's the way that I've seen it, instead of stopping in what we see so often in Scripture, which is this true? Did this happen? And you also mentioned something quite particular, which is that which informs our faith. But maybe there's an aspect where we want to almost idolize these things in a moment.
Right, because it's been done by humankind from the beginning. Early Christianity had to break away from that. And you can see the efforts to do that, and I'll talk about it in the next question I answer. I'm going to go through kind of a history of Christian iconography. But we do have today people that worship statues, icons, saints, and that is something that, of course, can be related to the creation of gods of the ancient classical world in ancient times. We have cell phones, we have planes, we can do all kinds of technological amazing things like this series online, but how different are we? How much smarter are we than really the ancient people? That's the question.
So in some ways, the very idea of, we can fall into the idea of worshiping the moments or finding faith in just the moments because we have archaeological evidence and the rest, that we forget the why. We forget the real reason why we can have faith in those moments. And so one of the other questions that came up that I want to mention that came up early on, and a couple of people asked it a while back, is why does it matter that we have good history connected to the Bible?
Sure, because unlike most other, say, Buddhism or philosophies of the world, and even Luke, when he starts out his gospel in the book of Acts, they say, this is what Jesus said and did. Christianity stands or falls by that. There are 2 things it has to require. It really happened and what they said. So I'm going to relate that. You can sit on Mars Hill and look out on the modern-day city of Athens of 5.5 million, and you can be moved by the thought that you are standing in a place where a man 20 centuries ago called Paul in the spring of the year 50 stood by himself in front of 100 PhDs and said, I brought you the one true God. And he's telling that to 100 PhDs at the time. Who not only were skeptical about the Greco-Roman gods, but they were definitely skeptical about this Eastern God, Jesus, that they had never heard of. But here's the thing. You can be moved by the moment that's sitting on Mars Hill, but the question is, are you going to read the letters that Paul wrote and follow the instructions that he gave about how to live your life, how to seek heaven, how to be a force for good in a world that needs change.
Well, thank you so much for answering this question and for being part of this. We're so grateful for all of you that are watching online and watching in different places. Make sure you do let us know where you're tuning in from, who all is there with you, and let us know so we can connect with you and see that. We're going to be taking probably about a 15 to 17-minute break, and we'll be back right at 7 p.m. Eastern for the next question, which is a fantastic one that you will not want to miss. We'll see you very soon. Welcome back. We're so excited that you're still with us right now. If you're joining us live, this has been already a wonderful evening as we answered the first question, and now we're heading into the second one. We're so grateful for wherever you're tuning in. In fact, let us know through Facebook, YouTube, or send us an email, Twitter, text, whatever you want to, pigeon carrier, I don't care. Just send us some information. Let us know where you're from so we can connect with you and encourage you hopefully in some way. We're excited about this second question that will also be answered by Dr. Terry Edwards, my father. He has come all the way from Henderson, Tennessee, where he is a professor of Bible and Humanities at Freed-Hardeman University. We're so grateful for his time and expertise as he has spent most of his life abroad in Italy and Greece and a lot of the lands around there. But more importantly for this question right now, we have the opportunity to look at art and beauty, because the question that you asked, that you as a community asked, and it was a fascinating one, is can we learn about God through beauty and art? It's with that in mind that I turn it over to Dr. Terry Edwards.
Thank you for staying again with us and for letting me answer this question. Let me give a couple of disclaimers. I'm not an artist. I can't draw a stick figure. I can appreciate art and I can study art. But when I was young, my father went as a missionary to a land that is said to possess 70% of the art of the Western world. And that, in a sense, makes you play soccer around the statue of David, which is one of the things I'm going to be talking about. That means that by osmosis, you get to live around, be around, see all the time some of the greatest products of human creativity. And so I'm excited to get to answer this. 30 minutes is not enough, but maybe I will be able to convey, as there are many ways to approach a subject. Yeah, I could do it from a point of view of philosophy as aesthetics, but that's too technical, and I wouldn't be the one to do it. I want to do specific examples of what art can do for the Christian to entice us to look at Scripture, read the story, and feel it for real, how art can contribute and how it's a useful aspect of the human condition. Let me first of all tell you, and I'll go ahead and turn this on and get moving. There it is. Let me go back here. There's a missing slide. There we go. That's okay. The head that you see on the slide is that of the Moses by David. It's in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli, St. Peter in Chains in Rome. Rome has 440 churches all over its gigantic space, and they go from various periods of early Christianity all the way to modern times. One of the greatest, most talented geniuses of all time. And by the way, he studied Latin, he was a banker, and he could paint. I guess the most famous ceiling in the world belongs to him, even though he insisted he wasn't a painter. But he wanted to be a sculptor because he grew up playing with some of the ones that made the stones for the city of Florence, the Topolino family. And he learned to appreciate what you could do with rock by taking off pieces. And from 1516 is one of the most famous images. And it is that of the Moses by David, a powerful figure that if he stood up could slam dunk over LeBron James easily. He is a massive figure, and one of the things that has intrigued art historians and even Sigmund Freud in the past times as they looked at this image of a biblical figure of old times from about 3,500 years ago is what moment did the artist freeze? You see, photography, when we freeze with phones now, is only a recent thing, about the last 150, 200 years. Before that, when you wanted to freeze a moment, you had to choose specifically, what is the moment I want to catch? And then you have to translate it into a painting on a wall, or you have to turn it into marble. And marble, by the way, is an amazing medium, because once you take it off, you can't put it back on with Elmer's glue. No mistakes allowed. You got to know what you're doing. And there he is. What is he looking at? It's either Exodus 32 or Exodus 34. He's either come down with the tablets which in the rest of the statue he's holding by side, and he's a massive beard, and he's holding that massive beard that goes down to his waist by his fingers, and it looks like the tablets of the law are about to slip out. Is he upset or is he in awe? Is it 32 or 34 of Exodus? Is it the moment when he hears the chants of the children of Israel as they dance around the golden calf, or is the moment when he is before God, sees God, and thus he is amazed in awe at the presence of God? God will tell him, take off your sandals. You're standing on holy ground when you come in the presence of God. Is it one of those two moments? That's what a statue can do. It can make you ask, go back to the biblical text. A painting can do that. They can make us live more fully, maybe, the biblical narrative and ask questions about it. Would you check on the PowerPoint, please, because it's not the right one? Thank you very much. Let me ask those in charge to check on the PowerPoint, because otherwise I'm kind of stuck here. Thank you. They're making adjustments. Evidently, the various topics were on the screen. Thank you for your patience. We'll get this fixed in just a second. Thank you. I need the PowerPoint pulled up. Yes, sir. Thank you. There it is. And let me go ahead and tell you what I was describing a minute ago. There he is, the powerful presence of Moses. How do you envision Moses? 120 years of his life, he lived on this earth, and he didn't want the job of leading a people. There are many times that God has a plan for us in our lives, and we don't want it. 40 years trained in the most wealthy, highly academic, incredible library in the Pharaoh's palace in Memphis in Egypt, and then that moment when he had to run and be a shepherd for the next 40 years and stay out of the way, of harm's way, and the guards of Pharaoh. And then that call at the burning bush to go back to that dangerous place and lead his people to freedom. That's the Moses. Think of it in those terms. Michelangelo took about 2 years to make this. He was doing it for a tomb of a pope, Julius II. But he was trying to connect with the powerful presence of the Pope at that time, who was Pope for 10 years during a very interesting times of when the Protestant Reformation was about to happen. So he's talking about the powerful presence of the Pope, but I'm less interested in that. I am interested in how he, as an artist, viewed the role, the presence, and the ultimate legacy of a man who did not want to lead, but ultimately led his people to freedom out of Egypt. So there you go. The arts don't belong to anybody but God. Music would be one I'd love to discuss, but all of the creative arts, architecture, all the things we are good at, including developments of technology nowadays. The arts are a gift from God. They're created by God, sanctioned by God. Marriage is made by God. That's a God thing. And the arts are a God thing as well. There's Jubal in Genesis chapter 4:21 as the first musician, the father of music. There is Bezalel, who is the major, one of many that are commissioned when making that temple. Finally, when the house of God, a permanent one, is allowed to be made by Solomon, and the most splendid temple is made, and he's one of those. There are biblical evidence for the fact that God is for the arts. He made us gifted. In fact, I have that even in, say, other settings, like, for example, in some caves of Neolithic man. I don't know what millennium they belong to. All I know is that man did not come in as an amoeba and go to a chimpanzee. He began as a smart, intelligent, rational thinking, and artistic man because he went into a cave. He wasn't caught there by a storm. It takes preparation for all the materials that they use for this, and the preparation of also the walls of the Lascaux caves in France. These are beautiful images, and look at the intentional way in which he represents the animals in perfect proportions, like bisons and horses and many other things, and yet he chooses intentionally to do in an abstract way the human figure. He's a good artist. Why did he do a man that's hunting there? Why did he do him as a stick figure? It's an intentional choice. Kind of like over here. We're in the Greek area, the islands in the Aegean, and this is the art of the Cycladic musicians, and many other statuettes of their gods are the same way. They chose intentionally to make the faces abstract. In the 20th century, we moved back to abstract art. but it's not the first time it's been done. It was done actually back then. Here are a harp player and a flute player. What am I doing out of this? I come out of it saying man is smart, intelligent, and artistic from the very beginning of his existence. And that's what I learned from it. Let me go back to the previous slide to say this. The arts can corrupt. And when they are misused and when they are misapplied, well, that's the problem. This does not mean that Christians must abandon. Quite the opposite. We need Christian artists. We need Christian musicians. We need people to pursue that which makes this world prettier and lighter and more beautiful, because it's a God thing for sure, and not relinquish these things to a secular world that sometimes abuses them. You see, in every aspect of life, in every profession, in every discipline, we have to make choices. We have to discriminate, so to speak. There is good and there's bad, and there's good, better, and best. And we need to make moral choices as followers of Christ, as Christians, with regard to the arts. And there have been, as of lately, maybe more poor choices in this area, both the music and of the visual arts. And I'll address that in a second. But here's the thing. A Christian can be an artist, may be an artist. And that artist, a Christian, will need to be discerning, yet appreciative of the fact that God made us very creative, like the incredible painter, whether it's one or many people, whether he's a man or a woman, I don't know. And these sculptors here, they intentionally had a design. It wasn't by accident. It was intentional, and it was brilliant, all of the above. There is an impression maybe that's left behind because God says in the Mosaic Commandments, commandment number 2, no graven images. The problem was the Canaanites. The problem was all those people that made man-made gods, Baal and many others. Don't be like your neighbors in that. Don't make images. Don't start worshiping an image. And here they are, the gods of the Mesopotamians, dressed like an aristocratic king. The god here, whether it's Enlil or Marduk, or whoever he is, has gigantic eyes. That was their way of portraying, look, the gods are, but they are scary, they're irrational, and they are not your friend, and they have nothing to do with love and grace. Here's, of course, other Canaanite gods. The beautiful sculpted image of the goddess Artemis, or Diana, she was called by the Romans. She was a huntress, and she was the moon goddess, and she was the most worshipped goddess in the 1st century AD. Most people went to hundreds of, if not dozens, maybe of temples made to her. The most prominent one was in Ephesus, 4 times larger than the Parthenon. And you could buy statuettes of her that were made out of terracotta or out of silver, like the ones that caused the revolt in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19. You could buy life-size statues, like we have found many copies in the ruins there. There's the god Hades, or Pluto, with his 3-headed Cerberus, the dog that keeps the souls of the dead. Mythologies and imaginary things. This is the problem. Why did God say to the Hebrew people, no graven images? Don't make pictures of me. I am spirit. Why did he do that? Because of the problem that mankind has with creating and worshiping an image or a statue or a made-up God that doesn't exist. It's not real. There's one of the Egyptian ones. Their pantheon of gods was highly sophisticated. The moon god. And they had marriages in the heavens too. No graven images. The Egyptians did the bodies of humans, and they put the heads of animals that were in their environment, like the hawk-headed god, the Anubis, and other gods like that. The Greeks did it fully looking like a human. All the gods of theirs were beautiful, except for one of them, which is the ugly god of the underworld. And there they made beautiful homes for the gods, like the Parthenon, which we addressed. Beautiful, best technology, best sculptors. Pentelion marble from 20 miles away. Took 11 years, and it was a marvel of engineering. Creativity used. Paul will say right on the outskirts of that temple right here, God has given you good seasons and bad seasons, victories and defeats. And he could have said too, because it was going on right behind him, and he's giving you talents and skills. But it's what you've done is invest them in non-existent gods. You can't go in here in a pagan temple. Only the priests do. You can see their statue, which is 40 feet high, and it's made out of gold and ivory and many other things. And that's the problem. When we worship the creation rather than the Creator, that's why the second commandment says, no graven images. Our tendency to go wrong. Here is a model of the temple. You see, the one by Solomon was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And over the 4 centuries between Nehemiah time and the time of Jesus, it was rebuilt. And Herod the Great had put a lot of money into in the last 30 years, and it was beautiful. And there it was, the Holy of Holies, the door that the whole high priest went into only once a year. And there's the courtyard of the women, courtyard of the men, and it was resplendent. And there were gates called Beautiful because they had bronze and they had precious metals, and it was absolutely gorgeous. So the problem is not that God's against the temple. The problem is the hearts of the people. See, I could look at this and say, look, God instituted for Solomon to build a house for him. He lived in a tabernacle for 5 centuries, and then he lived in a temple. But God is not living here anymore in spite of the beauty of the artistry and the craftsmanship and all of that, because the hearts of the people are not with him. He's not confined to live where you are unless you let him into your heart. If your heart's not with it, he's not going to be there, no matter how big of a temple how big of a church you build him. The building is not the issue. The issue is, where are the people? That's the question. Art is not the problem. The question is, where is your heart? The Christian community was illegal for over 2 centuries. Rome decided to start persecuting Christians, starting with Nero in the year 64. The worst persecutions of Christians happened under Diocletian in 295. Thousands of Christians were innocently killed in a blasphemous attempt they had lost to stop Christianity in its massive expansion. When you look at Acts chapter 1, there were 120 scared people. When you check back in the 4th century AD, when Christianity was legalized by Constantine in 313, by the Edict of Milan, there are nearly 34 million people by the best counts. Half the Roman Empire has converted quietly, secretly, tacitly, without church buildings. They have converted to the faith in the crucified Christ, and that is an amazing story. Only a God could do that. Christianity was born, they were all Jews at the beginning. They had no church buildings to decorate or do stuff in. They met in homes, but they buried their dead underground, especially in the largest city in the world, in Rome, in the capital, 2 million people. They want to bury their dead, their cemeteries, together. The pagans burned their bodies, ashes. They put them along the Roman roads leading outside of Rome. But Christians used underground tunnels in volcanic rock. And nowadays, archaeologists have discovered over 40 miles, some say even up to 60 miles of underground tunnels in 5 different levels that you go in. So you can be 150 feet underground, and they are places where Christians buried the whole body, not because we have instructions to do that. We can either burn them or bury them as they are in caskets. But early Christians wanted to do it different than the pagans. And the pagans burned and put them in mausoleums along the roads. So they went underground. And here are some of the carved out by professional diggers. The Romans knew this was going on. These strange sect of people called the Christians wanted to bury their dead differently. If you want to see the first picture of the Apostle Paul, here it is right here. Now, can you count on it? Absolutely not. Why? Because we have no images of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, any of the apostles, period. No graven images. Early Christians, who were all Jews at the beginning, then a bunch of pagans came in. They stuck with, let's not make images. Let's tell the stories, live out our life with faith in it, but let's not make images, okay? No images. So this, did he have a pointy beard? Was he balding? Maybe. I'll ask him when I get there. At the present moment, I'm sticking with, no, this is it's wishful thinking. We think Jesus is always portrayed artistically with long hair, but that's a misunderstanding. It's the difference between a Nazarite and Nazarene. Jesus was a Nazarene from Nazareth. He didn't practice the Nazarite vow, which means to grow your long hair. So he probably had short hair. That throws us all off. artistically speaking. But the iconography of Christianity is always Jesus with a beard and long hair. Beard is probably accurate. But again, let me start from the beginning. No idea what any of them look like, because the early Christian community was no graven images. They stuck with that. This is what they did. Symbols. They did the Good Shepherd. So an unbearded young Christ, there he is. And he is both the Lamb, because he gave himself, and he is the Good Shepherd. John chapter 10. They love that as an image. That is something very important to them. Here's a painting in one of the catacombs, again, of one of the most favorite images. By the way, what you will not find in early Christian cemeteries at all is a cross. They will continue to use that as a means of punishment until after the year 400, when the Romans were collapsing. That's only then when Christianity started adapting the cross as a symbol. No one wore jewelry with a cross. Nobody painted a cross. No crosses, because you and I wouldn't do it for a syringe for lethal injection or for electric chair. We wouldn't use that as a symbol of our faith. So the early Christians did not, until it ceased to be a means of capital punishment. So let me move on to this. When they were legalized, they finally could come above ground. 313, Constantine. And Constantine, mother, by all accounts, she was actually maybe a true believer. Constantine, I don't know. But the construction of buildings, like for example, in the area of Corinth, the third largest city of the Roman Empire that we saw in the previous, there are 13 smaller basilicas, that's the term for early Christian church, and then there's a huge one right here. Look, this is a Google picture, you can look it up. It's called Lecheum, Lecheun, and it's the remnants of a church building for 150 years between the 5th and 6th century, till the barbarians came, that was right there by the sea outside of the third largest city in the world. These are some of the leftovers. There are classrooms, and there's a baptistry outside, by the way, because they were still using baptistries until the 13th century in all church buildings that we might call Catholic or whatever, or since Catholic doesn't apply in the 6th century, they were still building baptistries for immersions. But this is what I'd like you to focus on. When they used their creative faith imagination to say, let's not just build a building, let's make it symbolic. And so they did. It's called the Latin cruciform style. And that's what many of the churches are in the western side of the Mediterranean world where Christianity moved. In the eastern side, they use a Greek cross. In the western side, they use a Latin cross. Latin cross is a long cross, while the Greek cross is like this, even sides. So it's smaller, so to speak. But here it is. These are the feet of Christ right here. When you walk into the church building, you're walking into the body of Christ. It's interesting how Paul uses that as a favorite metaphor for the church, right? Now, he doesn't mean the construction of it, but that when they built the building, they built it so that you would understand you're coming in to the body of Christ. And it's the feet of Christ. This is the narthex. This is the nave. It's the body of Christ. This is the transept. These are the arms of Christ. And there it is, the head of Christ, right up there, and what's called the apse. Those are architectural terms. So there you go. That's what they decided to do. Make it meaningful. You're walking in to the body of Christ. Very intentional. Now what's ironic is they took Roman Walmarts and modified them to make them look like a Christian church. Skip to the 14th century. For 1,000 years, when they started making images, the apostles, Mary, they started making up pictures because they didn't have any. The earliest depiction of a bearded Jesus that we have is from Syria in the 5th century. Besides that, all symbols, and nothing but symbols were used here. This is finally when the Proto-Renaissance, the greatest period of Western knowledge explosion, has happened recently with us with the digital revolution, and you're experiencing that with all this technology we're using. But 500 years ago, there was an explosion of knowledge, and God sprinkled on that area called Italy, sprinkled a lot of talent and genius that played out in the art world. Today, it's technology that's our main driver of change and shifts. Back then, it was the art world. And this is the Scrovegni Chapel in Verona, and that is by Giotto. And here's the miracle of Jesus. And he puts the story, he takes it out of a completely gold background, which it had been for about 9 centuries, and he puts a blue sky and a tree. It's an imaginary world. He'd never been to Palestine, Lazarus. He'd never been to Israel, but there is Jesus, and there's the gold halo around. And anybody that's an apostle or somebody has a halo, and if they don't, that means they're not. And there we have a beginning of describing, bringing the biblical narratives to the real world that you and I live in, instead of this ethereal gold world that it had lived in for centuries. I can't relate to gold. It was the most expensive color, and they loved it for centuries. But blue skies, like we have today in this beautiful Ohio fall weather that we're enjoying right now. There is ugliness, too, that's intentionally depicted. It's not all about beauty. You see, Mary Magdalene, she holds a very important function in the New Testament narrative, like all women do in the biblical narrative. Mary Magdalene, and all the rest of the entourage of women that traveled with them. Mary Magdalene was probably from the city of Magdala, which was just down the coast from Capernaum, where Jesus was. She may have been wealthy. There are instances why we think that may be the case. Either way, she was dedicated to Jesus. One of many women. She was at the cross. She's the first woman to see, first human being to see the resurrected Christ. And this is how Donatello, the early 15th century sculptor, chose to put her. What's the problem? Why is she ugly? Sculpted out of wood. It's because you have to remember where she came from. You see, possessed by 7 demons. I don't know why she was possessed by 7 demons. In normal circumstances, if I were to guess in the New Testament text, it would be because of lifestyles or choices. Okay? I do know that there's a child, at least one, that's possessed by a demon, and I have to guess that was a demon possession that was different. But in her case, Jesus expels 7 demons from her, and she dedicates her life. So this is her in prayer before. This is her before she is made beautiful again by Jesus. She's cleansed of the demons that were within her. This is one of the most famous by Michelangelo. We're talking about 60 years after the Mary Magdalene that you just saw by Donatello. We are at the High Renaissance. The magic years between 1490 and 1520 were amazing. I'll ask God when I get there, did you sprinkle on purpose geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci and Raffaello, Michelangelo, and all those other great architects? You just gave them an abundance of creativity. Was it the environment? Was it the place? Was it the time? Was it you that did that? He was 24 when he finished this. And this is a depiction of a story that shouldn't happen. You see, sometimes we forget Mary was at the cross. The mother was at the cross. A mother is not supposed to see her son die. It's not supposed to happen. That's not the way it's supposed to happen. But that's the way it was. She was there. Only one of the apostles was there, John. Men were hiding behind a closed door, scared. The women were there, and Mary was there, the mother was there, and he took care of her. He said to John, this is your mother. He took care of family affairs. He was leaving this earth. His responsibilities as a family man were ceasing at that moment and was dying on a cross. And this is him, dead. Michelangelo illegally studied corpses with the permission of a friend of his that was a priest. You weren't supposed to do that. The Catholic Church said that all bodies belong to the church as soon as they die, and no experimentations. Wait a century later, and in Holland, they will start medical schools and do cadaver experimentation. Not yet. This is illegal. And he depicts a perfect Jesus. How, if you stood him up out of that lap of that, did you catch it? This is a 33-year-old man in the lap of his mother who looks like she's permanently into 20, right? And she's beautiful, perfect, idealized. Now, Mary had sin like you and I. The doctrine of the no sinfulness of Mary is an unfortunate doctrine that has transpired in the centuries since the New Testament times. But that said, when you read the beautiful hymn that Mary, who was probably 14 or 15 when an angel appeared to her and said, "You're pregnant." "No, I'm not." "Can't be. Engagements lasted a year. What's Joseph going to say? He's going to get his own angelic appearance too, to make sure he doesn't cast you out or worse. Okay? This is a mother who's holding the body of her son. Do we remember the humanity of Jesus? Do we remember the humanity of Mary? Maybe that's what Michelangelo. You see, Michelangelo lost his mother when he was young. And the only subject he ever did, he did a bunch in his 89 years, the only subject that he did more than once was a mother mourning for her son. It's called pietà in Italian, mourning, okay? Why? Because he was the son who mourned for his mother, because he had lost her when he was young. Maybe that's what art can do, you know. The David is probably the most famous statue in the world. It's 14 foot high, and it's about a king, a shepherd boy. So let me get this straight. He couldn't fit in the weapons of Saul, King Saul, because Saul was much taller than him and a lot more handsome and good looking. And yet here all that matters in this statue is the look that he's giving across the valley of Elah. Who's he looking at? Who do you think he's looking at? None of his brothers whom he went to give sandwiches to, none of them will step up to the challenge of Goliath twice a day. And that's the problem. Who's going to stand up for God? Oh, by the way, he's got 5 stones. But if God is with you, how many stones do you need? 1. You don't need 5 stones. The others are useless. Throw them on the ground. If God is with you, who can be against you? Did Paul say that in Romans chapter 8? He did, didn't he? That's what he's doing. He's staring across the valley. It's before the battle. All the Davids of before have been done after the battle, and the head of Goliath is on the ground cut off with Goliath's sword. He does it before the battle. So he's saying, you can be confident. You and I are facing a giant of an enemy. Secularism, worldly view, anti-Christian bias is always going to be there. It's a giant. It's Goliath. He's 9 foot tall, and by the way, the tip end of a spear weighs 17 pounds. How are you going to face that? I'm going to catch him right here with 1 stone, and God's going to help me. May God help us. All of the above. The David, what is it about? It's about in Christ alone we are victorious. Is that right? Let me see if I got one more. Is that right? One more? All right. This is 1590s. One of my favorite painters, Rome. By the way, he was a scoundrel. He was a drinker. And he was in trouble with the law for the last 10 years of his life and running. So sometimes the life of the artist has nothing to do with. Michelangelo, at the end of his life, 89, worried that he had let his talent, the creativeness, the abilities that God gave him, the opportunities. He served several popes, and he was in charge of all the art of Rome for about 40 years, including St. Peter's Cathedral. That he had misused it, that he had let his art and his talent rule him and run him. And he will say in his letters, I betrayed God by taking a gift he gave me and misusing it, not using it for his glory. Mr. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, he goes by the name of his village, Caravaggio. He, in spite of his life and his life choices and all the bad things I could tell you about his biography, he was able to fix the moment of one of the great post-resurrection appearances. This is why I find art and beauty to be important. There it is, narrated in Luke chapter 24. There are 2 men that are walking away from Jerusalem. It's the day of the resurrection. They don't know Jesus resurrected, and a stranger comes behind him. And you can read the story and says, what's going on? And they're incensed. Are you the only one in Jerusalem that doesn't know what's been going on? Where have you been? There have been earthquakes, zombies walking around town. And by the way, the curtain of the temple split. Where have you been? Have you been holed up somewhere? Where have you been? And then he started talking about the messianic prophecies, and they were intrigued and interested. And they got to their village 7 miles away, and they invited him for supper. There they are at the dinner table. And Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, he focuses only on the essentials, forget all the distractions. He puts a blank screen on the back, and he goes and gets, for the first time ever, real models to play. You play Jesus. You play the 2 disciples. You play the innkeeper who doesn't have a clue what's going on right now. Because when he goes like this, he freezes the moment. When he goes like this, He breaks the bread. Suddenly, what are these two doing? One explodes to the side, the other one puts his arm on the chair. They realize who they've been talking to for the last few hours. Who they've been talking to? They've been talking to the resurrected Jesus. They got their own personal appearance of the resurrected Jesus. Sometimes art can bring back to life maybe a narrative that we've read several times, preached from. We know them, but maybe an image can say everything. I'm going to stop here because my time's up. Is that correct? Okay, all right. And I'll take questions. There are others images, but that's okay.
I appreciate the answer to that question. This is a fascinating one because I was surprised that this question was asked, but not necessarily because of the lack of importance that it has, but it does seem to be something that has come about as a conversation more recently in our culture and time. In fact, there's a lot of art has become subjective. Art has become so interpretive in a lot of ways. And so speak to that a little bit, the kind of the interpretive nature of art. And do you believe that all art is good art or all art is beautiful?
No. Can I go back to the screen
Sure.
if that's possible? Okay, I'll come back to my seat here. This is 1934, Picasso, maybe he did it intentionally in black and white. He was supposed to do it for a fair, and then a bombing happened. It was a period of the fascists in Spain, and he was not a believer, but he fragmented, he broke up. This was the Expressionist movement, and there's nothing beautiful about it. But of course, he didn't want there to be anything because all the men were gone to war, and it was mostly women and children that were absolutely destroyed by an act of war in the name of politics. He was incensed, and he wanted, and it's a large mural that took him a long time to do. The 20th century saw a major shift. The art that I've been sharing was from the early Christian period and then mostly the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, it was representative art. In the last 150 years, we've gotten away from God, and we've gotten away from representative art too. So what is beautiful has become relative. You can't tell what the story is. I know what the story is here, but when I go to Jackson Pollock, who, by the way, the value of this is incredible. I'm not disputing the artistry at all, but I'm saying look at the titles, number 1, number 5. There's color, but there's no story, or you make up the story. Or if you knew the story, I don't know what it is. There's no story to be told anymore. The narrative is gone. It's kind of like a classical piece of music. Same time period, by the way, of the changes in art. We have dodecaphony, and we have 12-tone tonality. Instead of, say, American musicals or jazz, we go to, and the people stop going to classical music because they couldn't understand it, couldn't relate to it. And by the way, it takes really good musicians to play it. Now, not all of modern music is bad, but we have lost track. In fact, in the rest of the slide, here is what Gene Edward Bate says. He wrote about 30 years ago, but it applies to the 20th century when the shift changed, and still to our day it's partly. The late 20th century is a paradox because art is still expensive, but it's also ugly, or at least since beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I get to say that, even though I'm not an art historian, and maybe neither are you. We don't take our word from an art critic anymore. Why is it worth $20 million? Why is that Jackson Pollock worth $20 million? Appreciation of the arts now has become kind of like a sign of status, okay? Social elitism, sophistication, things we don't know the meaning. The title doesn't tell anything. There may not be a title, all of the above. And most art, this is my words, I'll stand by, is bad. Is bad. And what the tragedy is, that commercialism makes it that people that are furnishing banks or various places, they have to spend a lot of money for bad art. And I'm not saying we have to go back to the Renaissance or to the Baroque even, the period right after that. But representational, one that tells a story, it's kind of like in music, again, to use the other arts. You need a melody. You need a melody. It's not just notes. Melody is an essential function of the musical arts that we're given, okay? Let me see if I have anything else. No, that's all. I would urge for a recovery of the Christians need to take back art peaceably. Make it ours again. Make it tell a story. Demand that it explain things. It doesn't have to be just Bible, but Bible needs to be not sacrilegious, but it needs to be respectful. It needs to be a holy use of it. That is, if you are not a Christian, then please don't use art sacrilegiously against the Bible.
Well, what's interesting is the very aspect of storytelling in art is kind of a lost thing.
Exactly.
But storytelling is actually coming back into play quite a bit in our culture because there's been such a lack of
That's right.
story in art and beauty.
That's right.
What's even fascinating is even what we're doing right now is art. What we are participating in, as you noted, the technology, the media, and the rest, the portrayal, hopefully you see the thought process that has gone into not just the questions, but the design, the actual the staging that we've done and the rest. All of this is a representative aspect of art. In fact, I often joke about the fact that when you produce something or create something, it should look like you care. It should look like there's been some thought and process into it. And that's something that oftentimes has been missing. Instead, we might focus on just that which we like, which is, again, still the interpretive nature. This is what I like, as opposed to what would best tell this story. And that's such a fascinating thing with art. Now, a few years ago, there was actually some pushback to, especially even with the school and the rest,
Sure.
to the very nature of art and the usage specifically of art, especially as it pertains to nudity.
Right.
So speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Well, that's the problem. Nudity had been out of the Christian iconography totally for 1,000 years. There was no nude. Mary Magdalene that I showed you, the artist Donatello, is the first one to do a David in the nude completely. Now that was risky in 1430, and he got away with it. And that's why the rest of the statue of the David by Michelangelo is also nude. I didn't put it in the screen, did not offend anybody. I will say this, it's not always intended to be, it's not sexual or overly that way. That said, how do you play modesty into the whole issue as a Christian? Here's the point. The Renaissance got a lot of things right, but the pagan aspects of retrieving Greco-Roman statuary brought in the naked pagan gods. So suddenly you have a naked David and a naked. It's the influence of pagan culture that resurfaces at the same time that we recover the ability to use art as a issue.
That's a fascinating thing. In fact, one of the discussions that I grew up with as a kid, growing up, I jokingly, I got dragged to all these places most of my childhood. In fact, what y'all are experiencing in a lot of ways is my childhood on fast forward over these last two questions. But one of the things that was fascinating to me about going into the different Catholic churches as a child was the story narrative, the way they used art from the left all the way through to Christ in the center and all the way to the right. That art is not something new to the church in a lot of ways. There has been a reawakening of these things, but there's also been a kind of a dying out of that even within the Christian world over the last, as you know, 150, 200 years, where we no longer have used this medium to tell the story of the Bible and the rest.
We do it for children, VBS books, VBS shows. Okay, so why is it that as adults we lose that chance? That said, remember the warning, no graven images. Remember the warning, this is not Jesus. We don't worship the image. The image, we don't get to God through an image. We let an image maybe retell us the story that's in the scripture, that's in the written word. That's how I see its function.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us at this point in time. Appreciate you taking on these first two questions. We will have about a 15-minute break, and we'll be back for our third and final question this evening with Dr. Bruce McClarty. We're very excited for that question. Are Christians anti-science and anti-education? So tune back in about 15 minutes. We look forward to having you back with us. Welcome back. It's so great to see all of you once again. No matter where you're tuning in from online or if you're watching this later, let us know where you're at. Let us know what you think about these questions. If you've got follow-up questions during the live event, send them in. We'd love to respond to you or talk to you off of that. Tonight, we're getting to our third and final question for this evening, but I want to make sure I automatically tell you and remember to tell you that we have 3 more nights of this. We'll be answering 9 more questions. That's where we get 12 questions from. So this first night we will be answering 3 questions, and then tomorrow night, starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, we will begin our 4th question, followed in by the 5th and the 6th. Each night, we invite you back to join us right here live on YouTube or Facebook Live. Hope you can join us for that. I'm very announce to you who our next speaker is. I'm grateful for Dr. Bruce McClarty, who has come all the way from Tennessee to join us for this wonderful, wonderful event. And he will be dealing with a fascinating subject this evening: are Christians anti-science and anti-education? Now, Dr. Bruce McClarty is a fantastic choice for this question, not because I chose him, but because he has the specific credentials to answer this one. He's the former president of Harding University and now is the minister in residence at Freed-Hardeman University. And we're so grateful for his experience and his expertise in Christian education, in education on the whole, and specifically working with college students and students across the world. So I'm very excited to be able to turn over to him at this point in time, to Dr. Bruce McClarty, the opportunity to answer this question that you have asked: are Christians anti-science and anti-education? Dr. McClarty?
Thank you, Brandon. Good to be with you, and good to have this question on the board for us to ask. And the graphic, I hope you've noticed and looked in closely at it, that there are some small words that are through all of this, like squash or backbiting or defame or belittle or knock, slam, scorn, slander, rip, diminish. A lot of hostile words, a lot of hostility in our culture right now as people are debating a lot of these topics, and it causes the question to be brought up of, are Christians anti-science and anti-education? Well, I want to begin by saying some things just to be very, very clear about this. First is that Christians are not supportive of everything that is done in the name of science. We will admit to that. So to say that Christians are not anti-science, and yet to say it doesn't mean that we are gullible or that we buy everything. And the truth of the matter is, on just almost any topic you can pick, there will be scientists who are saying different things among themselves. So to say, don't you believe what science says? Well, I could give you the names of several scientists who disagree with each other. So there's not just one thing that Christians might disagree with. But Christians are not supportive of everything that's done in the name of science. Secondly, Christians are not supportive of everything done in the name of education. There's a lot of educational theory out there, a lot of things that have been tried. One of the truest things in the field of education is that whatever is today, it's not going to be here tomorrow. It will be changed. There will be new studies. Have you seen what the latest research says? And so there will be all kinds of adaptations that are made and new things that are tried. A progressive field that is always reaching for ways to teach better, to understand better. Christians are not supportive of everything that's done in the name of education. And I think it needs to be said to understand and appreciate those first 2 statements, that Christians are not supportive of everything done in the name of Christianity. There are many things that are done in the name of Christianity that I am 100% opposed to. I am a Christian. I have given my life to Jesus. I want to walk in His steps. I want to revere God and count Him as holy in my life. But that does not mean that I am a standing yes vote for everything that anybody wants to say in the name of Christianity. So all of this taken together just simply says, let's think and let's reason together. And let's be honest about what we're talking about. And let's ask the next question. Instead of, like that screen that was up here at the very beginning, instead of our being ready always just to go to blows with people about things, instead let's ask the question and find out really what they're saying. And let's explain ourselves in really what we're saying. And I believe that a lot of times we can find more common ground than we think for at first. For 7 years, I was the president of a Christian university, Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas. And it is a university that is accredited by the Higher Learning Commission. The Higher Learning Commission is the same accrediting body that accredits the Ohio State University, on whose campus we are recording this tonight. So the same people who say that this is a legitimate educational experience here at the Ohio State University are the ones who accredited our institution at Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas. The university I served had a robust and very respectable College of Education. It had a very robust and respected College of Engineering and Sciences. Our graduates were in high demand in every direction. People going to medical schools, going into the allied health fields, going into research, people going on to do doctoral work, students who were respected in the academic arena very highly, who had gone through a Christian university, a university that says at the very beginning that we are at our core a Christian university. And so the belief that God is and that God has revealed himself, those things are our core and are central. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a College of Education or that we don't have laboratories. It doesn't mean that we don't have science classes. These are things instead that we believe there is a way to integrate faith and learning. They're not things that move in opposite directions, but it's something that we believe that for a Christian, it is something that inspires us, moves us, challenges us in moving on and pursuing the sciences and pursuing education. As Christians, we believe that we have been called to love the Lord our God with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength. Christians are called to be a thinking people, a people who engage our minds in what would be described as the sciences, in trying to understand the world that we live in trying to understand one another, and trying to understand governments, and trying to understand all sorts of things. We are applying the mind that God gave us to understanding this world in which we live. Here are the instructions as our instructions as Christians for living in a time such as ours. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet, do it with gentleness and respect. How different is this from the spirit of our day? We're talking about education and sciences right here. We're talking about religion. We're talking about faith. We're talking about all of these things. But instead of like that opening screen that had those words, those hostile, battling words thrown up there, instead of the image of boxing gloves and let's go after each other, notice what's said here. Christians in the very first century were called upon, honor Christ as Lord, the Lord as holy. These are devout people. These are people who believe in God, who believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And then this language of always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you. It doesn't say be defensive. It doesn't say be hostile. It doesn't say be arrogant. But it does say be ready to make a defense. Engage the mind. Be ready to explain why it is that we believe what we do and say what we say. So it's not be defensive, but it's be ready to make a defense. Very different things here. And it's people are going to see that we are different, and they will ask a reason for the hope that is within us. Maybe my favorite part of this passage is the very end where it says, yet do it with gentleness and respect. There is a way to engage philosophical arguments. There is a way to engage academic debate that is hostile and that is nasty. And there's a way to do things like that, though, that is done with gentleness and respect. Treating people with respect, handling them gently, but being very firm, clear, confident about what it is that we have to defend. The collision of the ideas that gives rise to the subject for this evening is something that I experienced in the first and second grade. I'd like to share with you what it was like for me, first and second grade. I remember becoming aware of church and of faith at about that age. I remember especially Sunday nights. We lived in Little Rock, Arkansas, and my family of 4 children, my mom and dad, we attended the Pulaski Heights Church of Christ. I remember on Sunday nights, I still can close my eyes and I can remember the smell and I can remember the feelings. And I remember that God seemed so near that it was like I could feel His breath on the back of my neck. And I had the sense that when we bowed our heads and prayed, it was like God leaned forward to hear our prayers. We were praying right into the ear of God. I remember that when we sang, I had the sense of God's delight in hearing what our hearts were lifting up in song. I remember what it was like to hear the preacher walk into the pulpit, open a Bible, and he brought a message from God. God was the explanation of it all. God was at the center of it all. God was the reason that we were alive and the reason that we were there and the reason that we had come there to worship. I remember first and second grade, Little Rock, Arkansas, Sunday nights, God being so near that I could feel His breath on the back of my neck. Church would be over. We would hug our friends and we'd leave and we'd load up into the station wagon and we would head home. And our family typically would stop on the way home at Shipley Donuts. Mom would get out of the car and go in and get some hot donuts while we watched the man tossing the donut dough in the window. She'd get back in the car. Again, I could close my eyes. I could still smell those donuts. And we would get in the car and we'd head home. Mom and Dad almost always had invited someone to go home with us. And it was a really good night for me if the folks they invited had kids. And so we'd get home, they'd make coffee, serve the kids some hot donuts and some milk, and we'd go off into the living room and watch TV. And there on the TV, we would watch, typically, The Wonderful World of Disney. Now, if you were about my age and you grew up going to church on Sunday nights, you never saw the first 15 minutes of The Wonderful World of Disney. But you saw the rest of it. And it was an especially wonderful night if when we were watching this, if it was one of those old classic cartoons or movies. Oftentimes, though, it was a science feature. And it would be the running of the wildebeest, or it would be a study of volcanoes, or it would be something about the stars, or fish way down deep in the ocean. And it would be some scientific thing that we were watching. I didn't have words to put with what was happening to me on those Sunday nights for several decades later. But as a 7, 8-year-old, I was experiencing worldview whiplash. When I had been at church earlier in the evening, I was a part of a world where the worldview was theism. It was the belief in God. God is the explanation of all that is. God created. God made us. We are in the image of God. We live accountable before God. God is the center and the thing that holds everything together. We got in the car, went by Shipley Donuts, went home and sat in front of a television set, and as a 7-year-old, I'm confronted with an entirely different worldview. The Wonderful World of Disney was all about materialism and naturalism. Now, they never said that, but they were describing a world where the material was all that there was. They were describing a world where natural processes, not supernatural processes, were the explanation of all of life. Now, a 7-year-old kid sitting there just trying to enjoy Disney on a Sunday night, and yet I was confronted with dramatically different world views. There were people who believed that there is a bias against the supernatural, and I had just come from a world where the supernatural was the explanation of absolutely everything. Disney never said there was no God. They never attacked the notion of God in any kind of a direct way. But they described a world where God had been removed from the discussion before the discussion ever started. And so there's no way to engage God and what's going on because, well, we don't talk about God, which is materialism and naturalism. That's the bias that's there. We don't talk about God. God's not in the room as we're trying to understand this created world and all that's going on in this. Well, Carl Sagan also would come along, and a few years later with Cosmos, he was fond of saying, the cosmos is all there is or ever was or ever will be. Sagan was an astronomer. And what he says right there, again, is materialism, naturalism. It is a bias against the supernatural. His statement right there, he doesn't say God. He doesn't have to say God. It's obvious he's describing a world, the cosmos, without God. He doesn't need God to describe the cosmos. The cosmos is all there is, or ever was, or ever will be. James Davidson Hunter, in his book, The Death of Character, and Hunter is the LaBrosse Levinson Distinguished Professor of Religion, Culture, and Social Theory at the University of Virginia. I wanted to get all of that exactly right. So, a professor at the University of Virginia, highly esteemed in his field for his culture studies and the philosophy of religion and such things. In his book, The Death of Character, he describes how he says, within academic discussion, through the work of such people as Erik Erikson and Benjamin Spock and Carl Rogers and B.F. Skinner and Haim Ginott and Rudolf Dreikurs, psychology as a field to explain, as one of the sciences, and a field to explain moral life and understanding. He says, psychology had no rival as a way to think about moral life and understanding. Notice this last sentence. Religious tradition was not so much attacked and debunked as it was explained, rationalized, and thus trivialized. And one of the biases for a lot of people involving education and the sciences is, if you can explain something, then you are the master of that thing. If you can say, okay, I understand how this works, then we no longer need God to explain this, and it's something that I speak with authority on. Religion as, in general, it was not so much attacked or debunked as it was explained, rationalized, and thus trivialized. That's the world we live in. And that's the collision that oftentimes happens in the sciences, and it happens in the larger field of education. A dear friend of mine, Dr. Don England, has given me a meaningful way, a very helpful way to me personally, to conceptualize how a Christian can be a scientist or an educator at a time when our worldviews are so often in great conflict. Dr. England, in his book, God, Are You Really There?, that I'll reference here in just a moment, he taught organic chemistry and biochemistry at Harding University for 45 years. I never took organic chemistry, never took biochemistry. I wasn't I wasn't terrified of them, but I respected them greatly as how difficult those classes could be. Dr. Don England, one of the brightest people I've ever known in my life, and he wrote this very down-to-earth and very helpful book, God, Are You Really There? And he writes in that book, he says, when I entered college as an 18-year-old Christian, aspiring to major in the sciences, I was naive to expect that everything I would learn in science would support Christian faith. Many things I learned did reinforce faith, but I also encountered areas of disagreement. If we correctly understand the nature of both science and Christian faith, we will not be surprised that conflicts sometimes exist. These conflicts need not be disastrous to faith. I wish that statement could be given to everybody who is entering university, that you are going to encounter things that are going to rock your world. You're going to encounter things that are going to challenge your faith. Not everything, but you're going to encounter some things. And these conflicts do not need to be disastrous to faith. He has a chart. It's so simple, and yet it is profound in its impact as we think about being a Christian dealing with science and education. It begins, this chart does, with the subject, conflict and agreement in science and faith, and talks about the truths of nature and the truths of the Bible. And he says we need to start by saying there's no conflict here. That there are all kinds of truths about this natural world in which we live. All kinds of truths about the heavens and about the earth and about the human body and about so many, many things that we study at a university. We have these truths of nature. And then we have the truths of the Bible. And he says, I don't believe there's a bit of conflict there. The next slide shows that the science is what studies the truths of nature. And that says university to a lot of us. But science is constantly studying the truths of nature. Bible study, individual, church Bible study. Bible study engages the truths of the Bible, seeking to discern what those things are. What does the Bible say about this? And people talk about it, and they discuss it, and they debate it. And probably a lot of atheists would be very surprised to find how robust the discussion is among Christians, trying to understand what is the Bible saying about X, Y, or Z. And then the best part, I think, of this little chart, he says, and then science comes up with interpretations of nature. And Bible study comes up with interpretations of the Bible. And in this area, there oftentimes are conflicts. The next slide sort of highlights this. And so this is where the conflict is. And if you and I can see that this is where so much of the battle is going on, and then we can back up and see the bigger picture, I think it makes a whole lot of sense for us to see, okay, this is where conflict is. The conflict is between interpretation of nature and interpretation of the Bible. And the problem can be on either side, or it can be on both sides. There can be a problem here. But we can still, even at that time, dealing with the conflicts and all, we can still be confident. And I believe in this, that the truths of nature and the truths of the Bible are not in conflict. Now, one of the things that is called for here, and we'll say a little more about this a little bit later, but one of the things that's called for here is a little more humility on the part of everyone. So that when we are doing battle right here, it may be that we need to back up and say, I need to look and see how confident I can really be of what I'm saying here. And that's something that can be said on both sides. We may be misinterpreting the Bible. We may be misinterpreting the the data of what we are studying right here. One final word about my friend, Dr. Don England. The Science and Engineering Building at Harding University is today named the Dr. Joseph Pryor and Dr. Don England building for the College of Engineering and Science. And this picture right here, this is Dr. England, and this picture right here is in a hallway that connects two critical buildings on the Harding University campus. The photographer in this picture is standing in the College of Bible building, the McIntyre College of Bible building. Taking this picture, and behind Dr. England, you are walking into the College of Science and Engineering building. So you have these two buildings that are next to each other. And when the science building was built, Dr. Don England requested that this text from Colossians chapter 2, verse 3, be put up above the door as you're walking out of the Bible building and into the science building. It's a passage that he had written on a piece of paper that was under glass in his office for many years in his 45-year career of teaching. In Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Isn't that an incredible passage to have over the door as you're walking in to study science, as you're walking in to study chemistry, as you're walking in to study biology, as you're walking in to study anatomy, as you're walking in to study the sciences that many people in the world would think you are now leaving Bible, you are walking into the land of atheism. Instead, Dr. England, I think rightly so, says this is the verse that belongs up there. In Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. I may not understand all of those, but I operate with the conviction that those things are hidden in Christ. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 3. I want to conclude this evening my comments by looking at Psalm 19. It's been described by some people as God's big book and God's little book. And God's big book is the universe. It's the sciences. It's this world that we research. The psalmist David said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day by day pours out speech, and night by night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words, whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the ends of the heavens, and its circuit to the ends of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat." The world, the heavens, declare the glory of God. This world that we live in so many ways, says the hand that made us is divine. In this psalm, that's God's big book. And then the psalmist transitions in verse 7 and begins to talk about God's little book, spiritual revelation, the revelation of Scripture. The law of the Lord, law meaning the teaching. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey, and the drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is your servant warned. In keeping them there is great reward. Who can discern his errors? Declare me innocent from hidden faults. Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sin. Let them not have dominion over me. Then shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. It's a bringing together of the things that we're talking about on this occasion. We're talking about God's big book and his little book. And then we go to that last slide that speaks of humility. Humility, and it's the big thing that's needed on all sides. We need to stop throwing words, and instead we need to start humbling ourselves before God, saying, yours is the creation, and Lord, I may not fully understand all that is.
Well, we're truly grateful for you taking the time to answer that question. I'll invite you to come over and join us over here, and we'll follow up with a few more questions. So I'm not surprised this question came up.
Yes.
Predictably, especially since, I don't know if you've heard about this, but we've had a pandemic the last couple of years, and science and culture and politics and the rest have not just come to the forefront, they've become major issues that directly have affected us probably in ways that they hadn't previously. So am I surprised this question came up in some way, especially since there is also, in some ways, and I don't want to say necessarily in a negative, but there was a little bit of an accusation, in essence, in some of the questions that were sent in, stating that those who are naturally anti-more science, so that Christians are more anti-science than predictably others.
Yeah.
However, that kind of misses in some ways the fact that this wasn't necessarily, the last couple of years hasn't really been a religious right versus the left, in essence. It's been very much, science has taken some hits. Because, and this is purely my perspective in a lot of ways, it would seem that science has a bit of an issue that has kind of arisen. Science is not without bias. Science is without its own agenda in some ways, but there's this assumption in culture that science is neutral, or that science will always find itself to be neutral. And I don't know how you've had to deal with that, but obviously within the academic world and the rest, there's been lots of different things. Campus here, you had to wear masks, all those things. People fought against it one way or the other. So how do you think that has played into even this animosity at times, even with science in Christianity? That's been a historical thing, but especially in these last couple of years.
Well, almost everything has been weaponized. Almost everything has been politicized. We have a history professor at Harding who wrote his doctoral dissertation on the pandemic of 1918. And so when COVID first happened and the students didn't come back from spring break in 2020, one of the first things I did was invite him over to my office. We sat at opposite ends of a long cabinet table and had a discussion. And it was fascinating because he had studied not only 1918, but a number of other pandemics through history. And I asked him, is there anything that makes this time different? And he thought for a moment and he said, yes. He said, this is the first one that I found any evidence that it was politicized. And so on all sides, it's politicized. And we won't go into who all is at fault because there's fault everywhere and all. I listened to an Audible book just last week. And it was called Premonition. And it was about the virus hunters through COVID, through 2020 especially, what was going on there. And for me, it was reliving something because I was a university president and we had to make the call to not bring them back after spring break in 2020. And then in the summer of 2020, there was a question for us, can you even have college in the fall? And if we do, I mean, there were people that came to me and said, if you have college in the fall, you will kill people. And one of the things out of the book Premonition that I listened to recently about those virus hunters and all, I guess if there's a big theme about it all, it is that people in public health had to make decisions without having all the information. And I thought, I feel that deeply. Because I was gathering everything that I could, but I didn't have enough. I didn't have it all. And the truth of the matter is, a whole lot of what we had when we made those decisions in the middle of 2020 isn't right. You know, science would say now is not right. And there are things that the message has been so inconsistent, coming from every direction and all. And so I think I think people have been dismayed at how what came from the government wasn't consistent, what came from the scientific community wasn't consistent. But the truth of the matter is we were all having to make decisions without having all the information we wanted. we weren't anti-science. We just didn't have the access to those things
Yeah.
and all. So I think it's unfortunate that there's been a politicization. It's become political.
Yeah.
That an issue like this, because it shouldn't be,
Yeah.
because lives are
Yeah.
at stake in all of this. But at the same time, this is not the smoking gun that
Sure.
says Christians are
Sure.
anti-science.
And that's the fascinating part, because I tend to actually classify it in some ways as there's been a weaponization of empathy, that even the concept of morality and so much of that has been portrayed as, well, if you don't do this, then you are this. And that's where that weaponization has come into play. But it's gone from the science world, but then they've used almost moral language, that if you don't do this, then you do not love these people. Or as you noted, that if you bring back students, you will, in essence, kill them. That weaponization is something that's new, and that's not necessarily something you automatically find in Christianity. However, that doesn't mean Christians haven't been also the ones using that terminology along the way. And candidly, part of that is just the balance that's been missing. That we seem to have been so pulled in so polar opposite directions that people will kind of base their understanding of you based solely off of whether or not you've had the vaccine or not. And that's such an interesting note, because historically there has been an aspect of science versus Christianity, even though even that has been kind of overplayed historically. But then you look at the last couple years, and we seem to have hit fast forward magnifying glass on all of that, and it's made this question so much so. So I'm glad that you were able to answer the way you were, that no, we're not, Christians are not anti-science or not anti-education. However, in the same light, it doesn't mean that we accept all things that is said as science or is said as education in those ways. Well, I'm so grateful for your time with us tonight and for being with us. You will be back with us again tomorrow night. Looking forward to that. So grateful for all of you that have tuned in from all over the world. So grateful for your presence, for those that you will watch in the future. Tonight we are wrapping up. However, we want to invite you back tomorrow night. We have a fantastic lineup of not just speakers, but also questions. It all begins at 6 p.m. Eastern. You can watch on Facebook Live from our page that you're watching with right now, or on YouTube if you're watching there. If you're watching after the fact, let us know still where you're coming from and where you watched and what questions you might have had based off of what you heard tonight. We would love to follow up with those. Tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Eastern, we will kick back off with Dr. Bruce McClarty coming back with us, who will be looking at, are Christians hypocrites? Should be a fantastic question to be answered. We look forward to having you with us. We'll see you then.